So I'm going to try to model a lot of what MYP is and take you through the various steps of the framework as we go through this morning. So one of the things about MYP that I think is often overlooked or underutilized are the aims of MYP, which are in the beginning, at the front of each of the subject guides. So I want us to begin by looking at what is it that MYP focuses on when it talks about aims. And it says here that the aims state, right, what the teacher may expect to teach and what the students should learn. Now, I'm a former English teacher, so I pay attention to language, and I especially like to look at verbs. So we're going to look at aims in terms of their verbs and what they tell us. But this is my favorite sentence in every subject guide, and I want us to pause here for a minute. What it says is that the aims suggest how the student may be changed by the learning experience. When I was preparing for today, even though I have just about 55 minutes with you, the big question I ask myself is, how do I want you to be changed in that amount of time? Because if you leave here in 55 minutes no different than when you entered, we've wasted an hour together. So in teaching, we have to always think about, when I create a unit, how do I want my students to be different at the end of the unit than they were at the beginning? Okay, that's really what the aims are all about. How will we change the students in some way? So I put together aims for you for this hour. I hope you will understand and appreciate an MYP concept-based approach to instruction. In addition, I hope you will apply or be able to apply that understanding when creating MYP units. Okay? And very important is that you will come to enjoy teaching at a higher level through a concept-based approach. Those are my aims for today. Now I said, let's look at the verbs. These are the verbs I just used in creating my aims. So I want you to look at those and think, what do they tell us about our focus this morning? Okay. Now I'm going to add the additional verbs that are used in almost every subject in terms of the aims. And then I'm going to ask you at your table to talk with the person next to you about, what do these verbs tell us about the aims of doing MYP? So these are the verbs I used. Now here are the rest of the verbs that you will see if you were to read all of the aims in all of the 8 subjects. So whenever you're ready, talk to the person next to you. What do these verbs suggest about the aims of the MYP program? And in just a few minutes, I'm going to start waving my hand. And when I do that, if you would please come back together so I can get us back focused. So look at these verbs, and what do the verbs suggest about the focus of MYP? Go ahead. Okay, I know that was a very short amount of time, but that was really just to get you starting to think, wake your brain up, get you going. Anyone care to tell the rest of us, what do these verbs suggest? As we look at this being the aim, this is the target, this is what we're shooting for, this is what we're hoping for, what do they suggest about the MYP program in terms of what we hope for our students? Okay, a lot of involvement, student-centered student involvement. Good, what else? Application of knowledge. Okay, notice that there's no word up there that says recall. okay? It's apply, appreciate, understand, okay? Use, engage. So I want us to keep these verbs in mind as we go through the rest, because very often when we get really focused on our content and our daily lessons, we forget that this is really what we should be about. And I know the MYP planner is cramped with lots of boxes to fill in, but I wish they would have included what is the aim of the unit. And I always ask teachers when working with them on creating units to pick one or two of the aims, because we sometimes lose that focus. And this helps us remember what the unit is really about. Then we go to objectives. So we have the aims, which are the big things we're focusing for, aiming for, and then the objectives are the roadmap to get us there. So again, I created objectives, and IB tells us they state the specific path to be taken to meet the aims. They define what the student will be able to accomplish. So here are my aims. I hope you'll be able to explain the philosophy of concept-based instruction by identifying and describing elements of the unit planner. I hope you can apply that understanding to your subject area by explaining each element of the planner. And you can analyze the effective use of MYP in concept-based instruction. So in order to accomplish my aims, these are my objectives. Now you want to key into these words. All of us know when using MYP, right, that just like DP, we have command terms. These tell us exactly what you should be able to do. Just like the objectives in MYP tell us what students should be able to do. Explain, identify, describe, apply, explain, and analyze. Therefore, these identify the big skills that our students need to develop. And these words are used across all subjects. So again, this is what I hope you could do by the end of our time this morning. So because we all are, I assume, from various subject areas, I decided to use the learner profile that we should all be familiar with to illustrate the MYP philosophy of concept-based learning. So you should be familiar with these words. Okay? So let's start with inquirers. What would be evidence? How would I know that as you sit here this morning, you are an inquirer? What would I see? What would I be able to observe you doing that would show me you are illustrating this trait? All right, one of the most obvious is that you're asking questions. What else? If you're on your phone or your computer, what would I hope you are doing? But if you are really inquiring, what are you possibly doing on your phone or your computer? You're researching, you're looking things up, okay? So we want to get really specific as to what you would be doing that would give me evidence of this characteristic. If you're talking to your neighbor, what would I hope that conversation is about or what you're talking about? What? This session. What else? What would I hope that I would hear in those conversations? What? Okay, but how do I know you're this specific trait? You are an inquirer. So what should, yes? Okay, you're asking for clarification. What else might you be doing? Yes? Perfect. Application type questions. How do I use this? How does this relate to what I'm doing? Okay, so it's really important as we go through this that we're always thinking about, once we identify what the aim and objective is, we have to then identify what would be evidence of that. How would the students show us they are meeting it? So the next step is always to start thinking about what is the evidence. So again, I'm going to ask you at your table to choose one of these other ones, these other four, and quickly at your table, pick one, knowledgeable, thinkers, communicators, whichever, and briefly start identifying as quickly as you can what would be the evidence of that trait. What would you need to see, to observe? What would you specifically have to identify? Go ahead. What would be observable? What could we identify? So for being a thinker, what would you want to be able to observe? Okay, a collaborative, putting together a design process that students get engaged at a high level. Yes? Anyone else? Observable, yes?
We talked about thinkers sometimes question the reliability of the information they're getting.
Okay, very good. That you're really questioning the reliability, the validity of the information you are using. Showing us that you're going deeper than the surface, right? Very good. Now, those were the more cognitive traits, right? These are the more effective, which are a little bit more difficult. But how would I know you're principled? What should I be able to observe that shows me you're principled? Staying on task, okay, you're not checking email, you're on task and you're focused. So we have these as well that we could go through, but for now we're not. What I want to really look at instead is there are different degrees to which you might be a thinker, you might be a communicator, okay? So when we think of assessment, what we're trying to decide or discern is to what degree does the student demonstrate what we're looking for? Okay, what is the degree to which they can do that? And we want to give authentic tasks, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, but what we're really looking at is how would we know you are doing what we want you to do? And it varies from a little to a lot. So if we use knowledgeable, you already indicated that some of you have less knowledge than more. So we have a continuum of a little knowledge to a lot of knowledge. And what we have to begin to think about is what is evidence of a little, and how does that evidence increase all the way up to completely, to fully, to having it all the way. So now what I want you to do is whatever trait you chose earlier, I want you to think about your students now. What would students who have that characteristic just a little look like versus students who have it a lot? Start setting the boundary of the continuum. What does it mean to be a little inquiring versus a lot? What does it mean to communicate just a little bit to communicate a lot? Start identifying what that looks like. So take whichever characteristic you worked on earlier and show what's a little versus a lot. Take a few minutes to do that. We're focused on evidence because really that's all assessment is. It's how do we collect evidence of what the student is currently able to do. And the reason we're collecting that evidence is so we know how we could help the student to move in that continuum from a little to a lot. Okay, or at least further. So I have some of you who are brand new with very little knowledge that I'm trying to increase your knowledge, but at the same time, there are some of you in the room with a lot of knowledge. And I have to be thinking, well, how can I still enhance that so you are also getting something from this morning? So just like you in your classroom, I have a differentiated classroom here. Okay? Because you all need to leave getting something. All right? And basically, what I'm trying to assess is where are you on the continuum, and how do I just keep moving you? It doesn't matter where you currently are, as long as I could keep moving you further. So, as you looked at some of your characteristics, how did you distinguish for your characteristic a little to a lot? Can I get a few examples? IB is giving us tools, which are the rubrics, that allow us to evaluate from a little to a lot, and the command terms often do that for us as well, and they follow Bloom's, that when you're doing any of those at a little, right, it's the basic, the fundamental, the recalling. I could do a little bit of research, but I'm not going deep into it. But as I get better with that characteristic, I go deeper, and it's a higher level. And I could start analyzing and evaluating and doing all those high-level things with whatever characteristic it is. 25 years ago, when I attended my very first orientation to IB, the phrase that hit me the most was they said, IB assesses students on what they know, not what they don't know. That was, for me, my biggest reflection, because I realized a lot of what I was doing was assessing students on what they don't know. So we always stated in the positive. It's not that you can't analyze, you're able to describe. And you're describing really well, but now I need you to explain and then ultimately analyze. And it makes a world of difference when you talk to students about what they can do rather than what they can't. So yes. So hopefully, as you were looking at your continuum for your characteristic, you were stating it in positives. Okay, what can a thinker, even if I'm only thinking at a very shallow level, what can I do? I could recognize things. Okay? I could recall some things. And then at a deeper level, I could start to describe it and give you more details. When I think even deeper, I can start explaining it, and then hopefully analyze and evaluate it. It's all stated in positives. So we're going to use our topic of an inquirer. And we're going to start by, okay, so what are some of the facts of being an inquirer? And we already identified some of those. You could ask questions. You could do research. You could see patterns. You're seeking answers. These are the specific things you can do. Okay? And as you think in terms of MYP Unit Planner, every unit has facts. If you're studying fractions, there are facts about fractions you need to know. If you're studying a historical event, there are facts you need to know. Analyzing literature, there are facts about the piece of literature you need to know. But then IB asks us to not just look at the facts, but to start thinking about what are the bigger ideas and the concepts. And that's where we start moving into concept-based learning. How do you develop a sense of wonder, curiosity? How do you become an observer? a problem solver. So as we move to concepts, we're now starting to think about the bigger ideas that, that kind of oversee the umbrella for those facts. I like to reference Wiggins and McTighe and their 3 learning goals because they apply so well to MYP and what we've been talking about so far. The first they identify is acquisition. It's learning the facts and knowledge. It's what most of us think about when we think of education. I'm going to learn something new. I'm going to acquire new information, right? And now we know we could do that within seconds with our phone. At any moment, we could Google something and get lots of facts. Okay, so acquisition is the searching and getting the facts. But then Wiggins and McTighe say the next learning goal is meaning making. What do those facts mean? How do we understand them? How do we make meaning of those facts? And this is the basis of a concept-based framework, that we go beyond the facts to make meaning. Okay? Understanding by design, a very complementary program, does the same thing. How do we understand the facts? But they don't stop at meaning making. They add the third learning goal, which is all IB, which is after you know and understand, how do you use it, apply it? How do you transfer it? So when we look at the rubrics in MYP, and we're going to look at the continuum of transfer, a lot of people call near transfer and far transfer. The easiest thing for us to do is transfer in similar situations, in familiar. Right? I think of the classic math. We learn how to do a math problem, and then for homework, I do 20 similar problems that look exactly the same with different numbers. That is near transfer. Okay? But then the teacher gives me a word problem that looks nothing like those homework examples and expects me to figure it out using that knowledge. That's far transfer, and it requires a much deeper level of understanding. So we have to move students from near to far transfer. In MYP, to get a 7 or 8, the highest level on the rubric, you must be able to transfer in unfamiliar situations. Far transfer. Because that's how I know you understand it a lot. You see, that's the difference from a little to a lot. A little is I could transfer in familiar. A lot is I could transfer in unfamiliar. So I want you to just think about what is evidence of a little to all the way to a lot. Okay, so our 3, every day, every period, every lesson, even every activity should include all 3. We never want to spend a ton of time on just acquisition. In fact, I started this morning with meaning making. I've been engaging you in the concept of concept-based learning rather than giving you tons of facts. Because as we build the concepts, now when I start going into the facts, they'll make more sense. And very often in instruction, we focus on the facts first, when really we should be focusing on constructing the meaning making so the facts make sense. This is why the unit planner does not begin with facts. It begins with concepts. Some of you may be familiar with Lynn Erickson, and this is her structure of knowledge. And I want to add this as we then look at the unit planner. Again, we begin with facts and topics. That's what we're most familiar with. And facts and topics are usually locked in time, place, and situation. In fact, topics and facts aren't very transferable. When students are locked into topic and facts, they often ask, how and when will I ever use this? Because they don't see the transferability. But when we get to concepts, which are the big ideas that are timeless, abstract, universal, and transferable, that's when students can start making connections. Then ultimately, Lynn Erickson says as we move up, we want to get to a generalization. The statement of inquiry in the MYP is a generalization. It's when we take two or more concepts and we show them in a relationship that is generally true. And I'll show you how that works with what we've been doing. Okay? So again, as we move from the foundation up, we go from the topic and the facts, the concrete, the acquisition, to the meaning making, to be able to understand, and then ultimately we get to the generalization that we could apply and transfer. So in terms of being an inquirer, you could ask questions about concept-based instruction. You could research concept-based instruction. You could look for similarities with other methods. You could explore the pros and cons of concept-based instruction. That's what you could do. That's what I could observe. What I'm hoping you're understanding is this involves wonder, curiosity, observation, problem solving. Those are my big ideas. And then my generalization that I want you to come to understand and apply could be through wonder and curiosity, we can seek answers to complex problems. Right here, we have basically the framework of MYP. We introduce, or we know that we're working from our statement of inquiry. We want students to come to understand my generalization or my statement of inquiry. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to build understanding around those concepts through those facts at the bottom. And here it is in the unit planner format. The key concepts are what Lynn Erickson calls the macro, the big ones, the ones that reach across subject areas. The micro are the more subject-specific that allow us to go into the subject. Those are the related concepts. That's why we have two different boxes rather than one. We want the big general concepts and the more subject-specific. We put it in a context to give students some relevancy. We write a statement of inquiry, which is really a generalization. It's usually true, mostly true. And then we ask factual questions, which is acquisition. What do you need to know? The conceptual is the meaning making. What do we want you to understand? And then the debatable is where we get a transfer and we ask you to do something that allows you to use that knowledge and understanding. By doing so, the MYP guarantees if we do this and then follow it in our instructional plans that we're hitting all three learning goals. You will acquire new information, you will understand the big ideas behind the information, and you will be able to transfer it by doing something as a result. So this is a chart that I put together in helping teachers figure out what really is different about MYP assessment. You see, in MYP, you could acquire 100% of the information, and in a traditional assessment, that would give you an A or 100, but it won't in MYP because that's just the foundation. Knowing something and knowing it well is the foundation to doing. What we're looking for and assessing is what you can do, not what you know. But you cannot do if you do not know. So we want students to understand you have to know stuff if you're going to do stuff. That's what we want our students to understand. Okay, doing requires knowing, but it's only the foundation. So at the simplest level, you could recall, you could state things, you could solve simple problems in familiar situations. As you move in the scale, you're starting to describe, and you could do simple and starting to do complex, and it's still in familiar. As you go further, you could explain why things happen, and you could do simple and complex, and you could do it in a variety of familiar situations. At the highest level, you can analyze, evaluate, synthesize a variety of challenging, complex problems, even in unfamiliar situations. This is the scale of when we are assessing for understanding. Whereas a traditional grading system, if you know 100% of the information, that alone can get you an A. Not so. You have to use that information, analyze it, evaluate it, solve complex problems with it, even in unfamiliar situations, to achieve at the highest level. We have a different continuum in MYP. Is again another way to look at it, from the little to a lot. Okay? Some of you may be familiar with a current movement that kind of started in the Chicago public schools of not yet, that we don't talk to students about failure, we just say you're not there yet. Again, you could get there, you're just not there yet. So same thing, at the lowest level, there's little evidence, but there's some. We identify what you could do. Then you start developing more evidence. You're approaching meeting the objective, and when you fully meet the objective, you're at the highest level. This chart you have on your handouts, basically what I did was I looked at what is it that we're looking for when we assess students, and what are the key indicator words that we use. Sometimes we're just looking for the frequency. How often do students do things? How often are you accurate in your mathematical computations? A little or a lot? How often do you spell correctly? How often do you use correct grammar? How often do you use the terminology of the subject? A little or a lot? Other times we're looking at the quality, from being basic all the way to perceptive, excellent, awesome, whatever you want to call it. When we look at problem solving, we're looking at simple problems as the basic level, all the way to challenging, complex problems. When we look at transfer, it's from familiar all the way to unfamiliar. And when we look at your critical thinking using Bloom's, it's from the basics of stating and recalling all the way to analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Robert Marchesano, I just put him up if any of you are familiar with his scale. It's basically the same scale. So here's what I want you to do now, is I want you to go back to your characteristic, and you're a little to a lot, and see if you could plug in some of these words to describe what is a little of that characteristic using these words, what's the next level, the third level. See if you can now distinguish by using words from this chart 4 levels of the characteristic you've been using with the learner profile. Try to write one statement for 4 different levels, starting from what would be the lowest level of that characteristic, to the next level, to the third, to the fourth. See if you could write one statement for 4 different levels of whichever learner profile characteristic you listed. So what would a level 1-2 inquirer look like using these words? What would a level 3-4 look like? What would a 5-6 look like? What would a 7 or 8 look like? See if you could actually write that statement for the 4 levels. You just have 2 minutes. So if everybody here, we chose reflective, and you said that I want them to be able to summarize the unit's objective. Now the first question I would ask you is that as far at the highest level that you want students to reflect? Okay, so what is summarize? Oh, okay, thank you. So summarize is going to be our 1-2 statement. And what do you hope they'll be able to do by 7 or 8? Let's go all the way up to 7 or 8. So if someone is really reflective, you have to ask, that's what we started with. What would be the evidence of being really reflective? Little evidence is I could summarize what I heard and think about it. At the highest level, what would you like to see? Discuss that they have understood and can apply and change something about themselves. That's a highly reflective person. And then we could use the words to describe 2 steps to get to that 7 or 8. That's really what we're saying. So if all I'm doing is summarizing and I want to get to actually apply and change myself, what are the 2 other steps to get there? I could describe what I'm currently doing. That might be the 3-4. And explain. I could describe and explain what I'm currently doing and what I want to be able to do. You see, that would be an intermediate step before actually being able to make the change. So what I want you to, again, to think about always is this continuum of if I only do it a little, but I want to do it a lot, and then what are the steps to get there? And these words help us identify what it should look like as you are approaching the 7 or 8. Because our goal is, unlike what people often think is no one should get a 7 or 8 in MYP, no, everyone should get a 7 or 8. And our question is, how do we move students to that 7 or 8? And what are the steps we're going to use to get them there? So we have to be able to identify what each of these stages looks like so we know how to help students move to that highest level. So if I was to assess you in the last 2 minutes that we have, I put this, some of you may be familiar with grasps, so I put it in grasps. Your goal is to convince your audience to move toward concept-based instruction using MYP. You are an instructional coach. Your audience are teachers in a traditional content-focused school. The situation is you want the school to move toward an MYP concept-based instruction to increase learning and relevancy, and you have to give them a presentation in which you will explain and justify with valid reasons why this instructional method will benefit your students. I have now given you an authentic task, and here's how I will assess you on that task. At the 1-2 level, you could state and define aspects of concept-based learning. As you advance, you'll be able to describe what the system looks like. You will then be able to explain why this system will improve student learning. And if you're at a 7 or 8, you will be able to not only explain but justify with valid reasons this system over a traditional content-focused system. The task is on the left, and here is the depth. I'm going to see where you're at and then try to keep moving you to that 7 or 8. This is basically the philosophy of MYP. This is what the unit planner does. And thanks to our sponsors here this morning, the Oxford textbooks are designed all around this approach that help teachers design units focused on the statement of inquiry, the concepts, the approaches to learning skills. So as you peruse those textbooks, look at what they can do to help teachers start moving to away from a content-focused curriculum to a more concept-based program. But I hope this gave you some general understanding and some way to advance your own implementation of MYP. So thank you. I know you have the general session to go on to.